समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
This is the death anniversary of General Krishnaswamy Sundarji, and on this anniversary, here's a tribute to a visionary military leader, mostly ahead of his time, mostly brilliant and sometimes a bit reckless. Soon after retiring as India's most talked about soldier since Sam Manekshaw, General Krishnaswamy Sundarji decided to become a columnist for us, then at India Today magazine. I might have played some role in persuading him to do so. His first few attempts were quite disastrous and we had a problem. How do you tell the great general with an ego larger than a strike corps that he could not write a column to save his life? He could not write to save his life. That he had to teach himself a new skill. I was assigned to carry the bad news to him at all of 32 years of age then. He was then recuperating from heart surgery at Delhi's military hospital in Delhi cantonment. So doc, he asked me sort of mockingly while he was still on his bed with tubes and things. So doc, he asked, is there still some hope or is the patient a write-off? Before I could figure out a diplomatic answer to this sarcasm, he asked more directly, I believe you think my writing is all bullshit. Where does that leave us? Are you going to tell me you're stopping the column? I think, General Sahib, I said, you need to be a bit more direct in your writing, just as you are when you speak. I then added as a smug afterthought, just come to the brass tacks quickly. In fact, your column should be called Brass Tacks. His eyes lit up. That's it, my friend. That is the name for my column. His next piece was a great improvement. The column ran for a long time under the title Brass Tacks. Retiring in the controversial aftermath of Operation Blue Star, Operation Brass Tacks, Exercise Brass Tacks rather, the IPKF and Bofors, this general tried his best to not just fade away like some others. He wrote columns, straddled the security seminar circuit, was painted larger than life on the Chatterati radar screen. He was at many parties quite regularly and generally emerged as the most articulate military spokesman for India's nuclear program. We sparred a great deal on the conference, seminar, track 2 circuit. We were together on many of these track 2 groups. He never could resist the temptation of pulling my leg over one military detail I got so horribly wrong in my coverage of Operation Blue Star. I thought confusing line of sight 25-pounder mountain guns, old guns, with larger artillery today was not such a big deal. That's a confusion. That's a mistake I made in my coverage of Operation Blue Star. For Sundar, as he insisted we call him, although I never could, it was an outrage. You journalists, you hacks, cannot tell the difference between bore and caliber, but can still be such big bores with low caliber. He would continue to rub it in. He himself had plenty to be defensive about. Both Blue Star and Operation Pavan, Sri Lanka, were tactical disasters. It may be unfair to suggest that you could spin a sequel to Norman Dixon's on the psychology of military incompetence around these two operations, but you could possibly pen a psychology of military arrogance. Sundarji was a grand strategist, a visionary who was better off moving mechanized divisions and field armies in wide open deserts, or better still, on ops room maps and sand models. He did himself injustice by getting directly involved in these operations. That is why it is so tragic that the legacy of one of India's two most brilliant military commanders will forever be marred by his record in what were at best battalion-sized operations. Students of Indian military history will quibble over whether Sundarji was ahead of his time or behind it. The truth, however, is both. In his approach to technology, mechanization, mobile warfare, he was way ahead of his time. He did sometimes admit that he had overreached himself in an exercise brass tacks. But he argued that was the only way he could get his field commanders to think big. Most of them, he said, had no experience of seeing a formation larger than a division move. Brass tacks had an entire field army in maneuver with live ammunition. And so what if it brought India to the brink of an unwanted, unplanned war with Pakistan? That was his outlook. And I quote from him, "You have this typical effing cowardly Indian thinking," he would say. But was he so impatient because politically he was a couple of decades behind his time? I think so. This was the beginning of the post-conventional or industrial scale warfare world, where nations preserved or enhanced their national interest by waging or resisting low-intensity conflict rather than Patton-esque set pieces, where diplomacy, politics, and then economics became the crucial prongs in strategic thinking. For Sundarji, low-intensity conflict was a bore. He dreamed of a heli-borne assault division and even designated one, 54th at Hyderabad, to be trained for that role. Almost immediately, he had to endure the embarrassment of seeing the same division's fighting units trapped under the LTT's deadly sniper fire and improvised explosive devices, IEDs, in Jaffna and the jungles around it. He had his critics, both within the army and outside it. The friendlier ones or the forgiving ones dismissed him as a well-meaning romantic with little relevance to his time. For them, brass tacks was his nostalgia for great old days of set piece, destiny of nations, battles, probably even an effort to create one to test his pet theories on the battlefield in the genuine Clausewitzian fog of war. I didn't believe it. For his more vicious critics, he nurtured a grand political ambition, and brass tacks with a resultant war and victory against Pakistan was to be his shortcut to political power. They, in my view, these vicious critics do the general great disservice, because one with such dispositions or careeristic outlook does not dare to question the Prime Minister of the day on the acquisition of his favorite toys, Bofors in this case, nor does he follow it up with a kiss and tell interview not long after, again given to India Today magazine, although not to me, to Raminder Singh. Sundarji hated these dirty little wars, Operation Blue Star, Jaffna, IPKF, Brahmaputra Valley, and so on. Brahmaputra Valley then had the Alpha insurgency raging. But that is all he was fated to fight, and not very successfully. He was not a tactical general. It was probably a combination of this failure and the belated realization that the days of conventional warfare were over that brought him in close touch with nuclear warfare. Soon he became its leading voice for India's nuclearization. We spent a week together in the summer of 1994, that is 32 years ago, in Salzburg with the usual suspects from India and Pakistan on the conflict resolution circuit. I got a chance to get back to Sundarji. Why, I asked, was it so that the most prominent nuclear hawks in India were from the south? Was it a diabolical Tamram conspiracy to get Punjabis on both sides of the border to incinerate each other so that the kings of Kumbakonam could rule the subcontinent forever? We had a good laugh. To be fair to him, however, even on the nuclear issue, Sundarji was by now evolving a doctrine of his own. And I'm quoting from him, "More is not needed when less is enough." He wanted India to develop a limited nuclear deterrent without entering into a nuclear race. It does not matter if the Pakistanis have 100 weapons and we have 10, he said. This is more than enough to finish all of Pakistan or to deter China. So why waste money building a Stalinist arsenal? That was his argument. Later, he would have been happy to sign the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, as well, engage in proliferation controls and develop confidence building measures and mutual restraint with Pakistan. This is after testing our own weapons. He would have also wanted a nuclear India to cut conventional force levels, mechanize, computerize, and embrace what was then called Revolution in Military Affairs, or RMA. Since then, there have been a couple more revolutions, and one is going on right now. If Sundarji had lived long enough, who knows? Sundarji would have written the strategist's obituary of the main battle tank or of the concept of a mechanized division, his most visible contribution to his army. You know the idea of rapids and ramets, reinforced army, plains infantry division, reinforced army, mountain infantry division. These came up in his time. Sundarji had a cutting tongue. and little discretion when provoked. At another India-Pakistan seminar, he fidgeted uneasily, visibly irritated as Pakistani participants took turns at giving vastly exaggerated numbers of Indian troops in Kashmir. 7 lakhs, 8 lakhs, like that. Pakistanis always do that. Then a former Pakistani army chief put the number firmly at 7 lakhs and Sundarji intervened. And I quote from him, "The only way you get to that number, General," that is what Sundarji said to the Pakistani general, "the only way you get to that number, General, is if you count the limbs, multiply by 4 and divide by 2. He said, deadpan. We took some time decoding this, but his Pakistani counterpart was quiet through the rest of the session. Much has been said of his peculiar equation with Rajiv Gandhi, and Arun Singh is de facto defense minister. I'm saying de facto because India did not have a full-time defense minister. Arun Singh's title was Minister of State, Defense Research and Development Organization, DRDO. But for Rajiv Gandhi, he was in a way the proxy defense minister. I recorded a 2-part walk the talk with him in 2007. He spoke a little bit about it, but not too much. It is possible still that one day Arun Singh would throw more light on this, give it a perspective that he owes to the memory and legacy of his favorite general. In one way, however, the general had his timing right. He took over the reins of the army under the political leadership of 2 young, tech-savvy political leaders, that is Rajiv Gandhi and Arun Singh. He did the rest. Sundarji did the rest. His domineering personality kept the civil servants at bay. He certainly would not have survived a Mulayam Singh Yadav, a George Fernandez or an A.K. Antony or vice versa, nor would they have survived him. Sundarji died at just 69, an age when great marshals were leading great armies into battle in the great wars. His death did not merit more than a single column mention below the fold on many front pages. Some, in fact, relegated it to the inside pages next morning. His life and work will be analyzed by future generations of soldiers and military historians. One question they will ask or answer is, what do we remember General Krishnaswamy Sundarji for? Hopefully, the answer would be brass tacks rather than Blue Star or Op Pavan. This takes me to August 14, 1990, Pakistan's Independence Day in Islamabad, and just a week after the encounter with Sundar, as he had taught us to call him, at Delhi's military hospital. At the afternoon official reception, I buttonholed General Mirza Aslam Beg. See the picture on your screens. He was the controversial Pakistani army chief who had just held exercise Zarb-e-Momin, the strike of the faithful, or more accurately, his counter-strike to what he saw brass tacks as 2.5 years earlier. The basic premise of Zarb-e-Momin was that in the next war, Foxland, as India is referred to in Pakistan war games, breaks through initially and Pakistan then counterattacks and envelops the invader. It was the first major Pakistani exercise that was so defensive in nature, where survival rather than an all-out victory or the liberation quote-unquote of Kashmir was the main objective. Surely, brass tacks and the scary and somewhat fictional vision of 3,000 Indian tanks rolling down the desert, threatening to bisect Pakistan, reaching Sakhar Barrage on day 1, all of this had changed a military mindset rooted in Pakistan in medieval history and thrust and parry purposelessness of India's armored strike forces in 1965 and 1971. So does your publication write a lot about defense and security? Beg asked me, making polite conversation. Yes, I said, we are now running Sundarji's column. What is it called? Beg asked. Brass tacks, I said. The temperature dropped a few degrees. The general's eyes did not exactly light up in delight. Would you still have any doubts about Sundarji's real legacy?